So, Joe, it's all down to you, because it's fascinating, isn't it? You know, you take any one subject, you dive in, and it splinters and splinters and splinters, and yet you're here to talk about the sort of the future and where we get to. So it'd be good if you could. I saw you making notes, nodding, furiously shaking your head,
my head,
all sorts of things. All the body language was there. So it'd be great to. I know you were going to say what you were going to say, but also just to pick up on some of the issues and actually, what do we do with all this? Not, you know, so great. We have all these different things out there. So we've created this universe of ideas. What do we do?
I'll try to, and I'll just preface something I'll come back to at the end if there's time, which is just, it's important to recognise we've been talking about push-pull and we've talked about subsidies, and okay, at the moment, the net market, as Mikkel said, the net market out there is completely divided into two completely different markets. There is the international procurement market in LLINs. The buyers are the international donors, the sellers are the small number of companies who have Hoopi's recommended LLIN products. And then there are the little local traders that Karen mentioned, who have their existing supply lines, a few of whom in some countries are selling LLINs, but by and large they're selling untreated nets of local manufacture. So those are quite separate. The one is completely subsidized, the other is completely unsubsidized, and to be honest, I think we should try to largely keep it that way. Particularly on there are one or two opportunities, new opportunities for supply side intervention on the commercial side, but on the whole, that seems to be okay. Okay, let me just get on quickly with the points I'm going to make. Some of them have been made before. Here, for example, is somebody selling largely cotton nets. Not much we can do to put insecticide on those, but we're in northern Nigeria, where as you head further and further into the Sahel, Nigeria, Niger, into Mali and Chad, you go to Timbuktu, the middle of nowhere, 90% of people are sleeping under traditionally made nets. So this is not a place, this is not about us introducing a net culture. These people have a net culture. Important to recognize for malaria control that treated nets are among the most powerful interventions we've ever had. There is no drug that can, like this is the first ever net trial, treated net trial, with child mortality as the outcome. We're in the Gambia. You can see the two collections of villages above the intervention villages, below the control villages. The first seasonal peak before intervention, that's the seasonal peak in child mortality towards the end of the rainy season, the beginning of the dry. Every year there's this huge peak in mortality. Before we had the treated nets, we were not sure that these deaths were malaria deaths, because the end of the rainy season brings a lot of other stresses with it, of course. It's the hungry time just before harvest, all of those things. But treating those nets completely removed the seasonal peak. What a powerful intervention. In that case, more than half of all child mortality was prevented by that simple intervention. So it's quite a special intervention, quite a special technology we've got here. In the last 10 years, WHO reckon that treated nets have sold about 1 million lives, almost entirely by treated nets, some by spraying, but almost entirely by treated nets, and the bulk of those million lives in the last 5 years. This huge push leading up to the 2010 targets to pump nets in there. Here are the main points I'm going to make. Impact I've just talked about. Now talk about use. There's a lot of nonsense talked about use, the gap in use. I think that, well, I'll show you figures in a minute, which I think put the lie to Egon 60%. Lovely figures from Mark Rowland in Afghanistan showing that heat, people always say, oh, it's too hot, I don't use nets when it's hot. Well, actually, here we are in Afghanistan. Now, in Afghanistan, when they say it's hot, they mean hot. They mean 40 degrees, right? This is a place where it's very hot in the hot season, but here we are. The hot season is also the mosquito season, and that's when people are using their nets. It's not true. There's lots of other myths. So it's not true, for example, that in some places the qualitative work, we sent qualitative social scientists out there to ask, oh, what about patterns of usage within the family? Reports go, oh, dad's going to steal the net. Well, in practice, it doesn't happen. That was some survey data that I was involved with. This is the much nicer WHO data. Here we have usage by age. So where's my pointer? Here we have the under 5s, 5 to 9s, 10 to 14. So it's in the teenage years that we get a dip in coverage in almost every country. Every one of those lines is a different country data set. It's an incredibly uniform pattern. Kids are the best covered, adult women next. It's this age group, the 5 to 9 children, that's a bit low. Otherwise, things are roughly the sorts of priority that we would want. And then the most important slide on usage, this is usage actually observed under the net. The proportion sleeping under a net in each one of these, each one of the data points is a country. This is a country data set. And this scale is the proportion of the population potentially under a net if there were 2 people sleeping under every net that's out there. So some countries have got more nets out there already than others. Some countries down here, actually the number of nets available quite low, others quite high. What we see is the slope of that line is about 80%. In other words, 80% of people who could be sleeping under a net, given 2 people per net, 80% are actually under the net. So I think it shows very clearly that actually the barrier is not that there are millions of nets out there not being used. That is so in some countries. So here, these countries here, for example, clearly usage is much lower than we would want. There are exceptions. But the rule is that usage is pretty good. So here's this thing that's arisen in the last sort of 6 or 7 years. The rate at which nets wear out is highly variable. When we started this big push of mass distributions, we were kind of assuming and hoping that every net will last exactly 3 years and then drop dead on its 3rd birthday, like a pair of army boots which is rated to last 3 years. Well, actually not every pair of army boots lasts exactly 3 years and then drops dead on its 3rd birthday. We can't plan like that. So how do we work with the fact that there's great variation between nets in a cohort, between settings, nets wear out more quickly in some places than others, and between net products, some nets last much longer than others. So we've seen a diagram like this already from Atto. WHO has already taken cognizance of the fact that, yes, if you rely on occasional mass distribution campaigns, as we were originally thinking we might do, you're going to get this kind of zigzag coverage pattern and unsatisfactory gaps in coverage in the intervals between campaigns, particularly towards the end of that interval. You have unsatisfactory levels of coverage here. So WHO already recommends that in addition to campaigns, the campaign should be the way to scale up coverage at first, but then countries should ensure that there is continuous distribution through antenatal clinics and through immunization clinics. Every pregnant woman who goes to antenatal should go home with a net. Every kid who completes DPT1, perhaps DPT3 if you want some incentive, should go home with a net. And if we did that, we would be maintaining continuous coverage of somewhere between 40 and 60%, given current antenatal care and immunization coverage rates. There are issues with supply chain. That's a big problem. But we're not asking more people to come, although probably more people would come to antenatal if they thought they were going to net. More kids would come for immunization, particularly to complete immunization, if they thought they were going to get a net. But that's using existing coverage rates. So we can fill those zigzag gaps already. WHO has also done something about this durability issue. One point that we've heard some complaints about hoopies. One of the key things that well, okay, I'm on hoopies, or have been, and one of the mistakes that hoopies made was to not make it clear to the Global Fund that it's a set of minimum standards. Hoopies tests nets against each minimum standard. This is not the same as pre-qualification. Hoopies never made the assertion that every net that passed its minimum standards was technically identical. However, the big procurers, including the Global Fund in particular, treated that as such, and they therefore required countries to put nets out to tender and to buy the cheapest unit price net. And that was the problem. You can see, just to illustrate some of those points, the rate at which nets acquire holes. This is data from Hoopi's reports, just replotted. The rates at which nets acquire holes varies a lot from country to country, between settings. But the key point is that Hoopi's is not recommending uniform standards nets. What WHO now says is that every country should be monitoring its own rate of LLI and durability. Why? Because this varies between countries, and also because which net is best in Chad may not be the net that's best in Uganda, may not be the net that's best in Liberia. We haven't got enough data yet to see what patterns are emerging, but even within the existing range of products, there's huge gains to be made, savings to be made by buying the longest lasting net for your own setting. Hence the guidelines on procurement of public health pesticide, which recommends that countries should compare products and do their product choice on the basis of cost per median year of net life. That's already in place. Now, implementing that, that's another story, but at least that is now implemented. I believe that if companies like the Mickle, Egon, people we've heard from, if they saw market share being taken by nets that have been shown to be longer lasting in given settings, they will rapidly move, not just to make the new nets that we've heard of with new active ingredients, but to make physically much more durable nets. And there is scope, I believe, for far better performance, doubling the life of a net. I think that's probably technically feasible once we start talking about moving into particularly strong polymers.
Can I just stop you there, Joe, for 1 second? Because I just want to pick up with because what you're saying is pretty important, is that actually the nets could last actually twice as long.
Yes, and if they did, then just giving out through antenatal and immunization channels would be enough to maintain steady state 80-90% coverage.
Yeah, and are you saying that the manufacturers aren't producing those? Why aren't they producing those?
They haven't had the incentive because we've been doing our tenders and buying nets on the basis of unit price, minimum unit price.
Okay.
So the incentive for a manufacturer is to make a net which is just strong enough to get through your Hoopi's recommendations, but no stronger.
Okay, so I'm going to stop for 1 second because I'm going to go, but Michaela, just respond to that, because that's quite important, isn't it? If you can actually have a net that lasts twice as long, and you have the distribution channel, what you're saying is that makes a huge difference just on its own.
What Joe's saying is true, but it's only half the story. The other half is every manufacturer will start developing it with all the protocols tested. What you're seeing with other nets today is that they're come with a net waited 7 years.
I just think it's clearly an important area.
So, I think the incentives are now more or less in place, but countries need to do the comparative monitoring to see whose net lasts longest in their particular setting. Then they have the data to prefer one rather than the other. So nets in the long run, it's important to recognize, I think, that even when, as Janet says, the worst has come about, the mosquitoes no longer care whether or not there's pyrethroid on these nets, they have super KDR or what mosquitoes, the mosquito version of that. We will still want treated nets. Nets will continue to be an intervention for malaria control for decades to come. We need to get used to it. Why? Because naturally there are the mosquitoes out there. Me, I'm in my bed. The net is a way to interpose something, if only just a piece of fabric, between that mosquito and me. It's remarkable we didn't use it before. So I'll show you some data in a second. Untreated nets do give half the protection of ITNs. So that market in untreated nets, as long as they're in good condition, I should stress. Once they get holes, no. But as long as they're still intact, those untreated nets out there have substantial public health value, which we neglect, I think, systematically. And then the question of new actives to put on nets, Janet's talked about, and Mikkel as well. So here's just some data. There's loads of data. Here's data from Helen Guy and Bob Snow, 10 years old now, from a variety of studies showing that, indeed, untreated nets do have good protective efficacy against parasitemia, against enlarged spleen, and against anemia. And there's even better data more recently confirming, it's remarkably consistent in confirming that untreated nets give about half the protection of a treated net. Here's a sort of small exception to that, which I thought was interesting, data that we collected last time from the Malaria Consortium, actually in Cambodia. So here is the odds ratio, the degree to which using any kind of net protects you in Cambodia. As Karen said, 80-something%, 85-odd% of people under any given night are sleeping under a net in Cambodia. And 90% of these nets are commercial untreated nets. A few of them, in our survey villages, there were government-treated nets out there, so we could ask about the protection both from any net and the additional protection from treatment. Using any net did protect you, gave you 60-odd% protection against malaria, but the additional protection from adding the insecticide wasn't that good. Now, one clear thing here, we need, while we're talking about what's happening with nets, okay, we've done that big push, what's going to be the next phase, we need to not lose pace. That's the funding, but there are people out there now who we have been protecting against malaria for the last 5 years. And if we don't replace those nets, things are going to be bad for those people. Much worse. So there's a kind of problem looming if we don't keep up our coverage. We've already talked about resurgences in some places. There were similar resurgences in Zambia to the ones Atto talked about in 09 and 10, when, again, nets were supposed to be replaced. They weren't replaced. There was a huge resurgence in a couple of the provinces where the nets had not been replaced. I think one of the issues in the long run, okay, we need to do something about the arms race. We're committed to this arms race with the mosquitoes about active ingredients. We've lost the game with pyrethroids. This is a rearguard action to try to preserve the last protection activity, usefulness of pyrethroids for the next few years before we can bring in some more actives. And really, IVCC under Janet has been leading that fight. But we will eventually want to move away from that towards untreated nets, towards other forms of non-chemical mosquito control. We can keep that arms race up for a couple of decades, but not for the 5 decades it will take us to get rid of malaria finally in Africa. And these are figures I took from the Global Malaria Action Plan. I think that globally the importance of the vectors and vector control is underestimated. Simply, the graph above is the proportion of global spending. The blue section of each line is the proportion of global spending on malaria control that is destined for vector control under the Global Malaria Action Plan. And these figures have actually turned out to be roughly accurate. They were projections when they were first written. This is how much the Global Malaria Action Plan projects to spend on research on vector control. So there's an awful lot of investment in drugs, in vaccines, but actually the bulk of those 1 million lives that were saved by new malaria control interventions, they were saved by vector control. Let me just skip forward.
I'm going to be tough on you.
Yeah, no, this is just pictures. Just pictures. 1 minute. Here we are. This is Net Street in the big wholesale market in Lagos. And each one of these traders is selling a whole variety of textile products, right? These are rag trade boys. And I'm sorry, you can't tell them about business, right? They know about business. These guys, in the days of Netmark, when companies that were allied with Netmark, this USAID project which was designed to promote the commercial market, Netmark, I'm sorry to say, decided that it was going to succeed better in getting long-lasting or treated nets into the field, better by allying itself with the established companies, including Mickle's company, and promoting those. So they put Mickle's nets in pharmacies. They then did an advertising campaign in Kano. We went back to Net Street, and this is what we found. This is in Lagos. Oh, how come you've got this? They said, oh, we got a call from our supplier in Kano. Why? Because his wholesalers had calls from their retailers, these are market traders, textile stalls in Kano, saying their customers had come in asking for treated nets. They'd never heard of it. But of course, if you're a Nigerian textile business person, you don't say, I've never heard of it, go somewhere else. You say, oh, I've just sold the last one, they're fantastic, come back next week. And you get on the phone to your supplier. So the retailers phoned the distributor phoned his supplier in Lagos. They went round the corner to find the treated net kits here to bundle with the nets. This is before the days of long-lasting insecticide-treated nets. If you want treated nets, we've got treated nets. We can do that. So what I'm saying is that actually the distribution system that Karen talked about, which is plugged into the demand, which is incredibly sensitive to demand, that is a huge part of the value of the whole system. Those people know how to sell nets. Now, I agree, now that we've been flooding countries like Nigeria with free nets, they're doing something else now. But they're still in the rag trade. And when somebody calls and says, have you got a treated net? They will say, I'm sorry, I've just sold the last one, come back next week. And they will get one within a week. It's very effective and it's very sensitive. We should not intervene on that side. I just recommend what Karen said, the supply side intervention that we should be thinking about is substituting the yarn that's made for those nets. It costs $3 a kilo, that yarn. For $4.50 a kilo, we could substitute long-lasting insecticide-treated yarn to be made in those same factories so that those boys would be selling proper LLIN fabric in their mosquito nets. It's crazy not to do it. I'm not saying we should rely on this for strategic cover, that should be the job of the national program manager in Nigeria to promote that. It's just huge public health value.
And just finally, Joe, are you saying that then the difference in price should be what should be subsidised?
Yes. And then all the rest happens by itself. We don't control the prices. We don't have to do all that. They'll be sold at their existing price.
And just finally, what would either help to make that happen or what would stop that from happening?
I think it would be good for WHO to nod positively in that direction, because I think that there might be donors who'd be interested in it, but they'd be worried about flack from WHO. They would want some protection, because they'll certainly get flack from the existing LLIN manufacturers, sorry, but. Okay.
Great. Thank you. We're way over time, which is okay because we've got time. But I want to give 5 minutes to whether there's expertise in the room, so you don't have to ask a question. You can actually give a response to something, but if you can keep it very quick. And then we're going to shorten the break because actually it doesn't take 15 minutes to refresh coffee. And so the one thing I will ask you is that there will be time at the end to sort of chat and meet people. So when we do come back together, if you can do it really quickly, just go and get a drink. If you need to go to the toilet quickly, then come and sit down and start, because I've been at 100 sessions like this where everyone says, I'll be back in 5 minutes, and then half an hour we're still trying to get people to sit down and say, look, can we do the work we want to do? So there will be informal networking then. But any comments, questions before we do take a break? Yes, sir. And can you just say who you are, where you're from?
My name is Zava. I'm from the World Health Organization. My question is to Janet about the distribution of resistance in Africa as a reflection of distribution of entomologists. How do you address that? Because I think those entomologists that are reflected in that map are actually researchers. And if you are talking about routine monitoring of insecticide resistance, that's the work of the National Malaria Control Program, which may not necessarily be inclined to doing research. I appreciate the role of identifying insecticide resistance mechanisms because that helps us target what intervention needs to be done, although we are limited by the current tools that we have. But how do you address that discrepancy? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So I think there are a couple of things you can do there. One is that with some of the new technologies that is coming in, you don't have to go out and collect lots of live insects to be able to do your testing in situ. And the very fact that you can move over to doing some basic testing using PCR or other methods, I think means it's easier to get collections and sort out sampling in multiple locations. So you don't physically have to put an entomologist in each place to be able to get these things done within the sort of set. So we are filling in the map as we go along. But I think the other side of this is having recognised that there is an issue here, we ought to be sharing this data. This data is important for the whole of Africa, not just for this bit or this bit or this bit, but it is a growing problem. That data ought to be out there in the community within the sort of set. It ought to be shared, and we ought to have a system of accessing that in reasonably real time, and that's missing at the moment. So we're not even collecting sensibly the data that we've got, and we need to make sure that we pull that together. But I think the technology is helping now that you can actually run samples, and you can collect samples just by putting relatively sort of simple traps out there and getting those samples in without needing somebody with a degree in entomology to go and collect those. Because if we've got to wait for that, we're going to be waiting until I'm long dead, and most of the people in the rest of the room as well. So I think we need to move away from that model, otherwise it won't work.
And John, just very briefly, I mean, there's lots of conversation this morning about data either being old, not being complete, not being clear. Mm-hmm. I mean, is data a sort of a reason? I mean, is the lack of quality of data or the lack of agreement about the data, is that a key problem all the way down the line, or actually, and is that getting better?
I'm not sure it's getting better. I would love to see some of the really big questions that we've got really properly thought through, and then say, okay, how are we going to tackle these? What are the absolute key experiments that need to be done? In how many locations do they need to be done for us to get a clear answer? Rather than 100 different groups making it up on their own, so you haven't got comparable data from different places, and what you get is tiny little snapshots here and there that you've got to wait an enormous amount of time then to try and piece together a picture.
Okay, so in principle, yes. What needs to happen? So you know, in systems, it's always about the levers of change, isn't it? There's lots of different players. Often they don't speak to each other. Even when they do speak to each other, they might disagree about certain things. So we've already seen some of that. And then you need the lever points where actually you can say, actually, who can actually help to make this happen? Or who do you need to get in the room to make this happen? So what is just on that as an example, what is the key lever to actually say, that's the problem. We know the solution in principle. What needs to happen to make that happen?
So some of these are quite big questions to look at, and I think the reason that they don't get tackled is that either people don't understand how big the question is and what you need to do to tackle it, or individual funders don't have the resources to be able to fund some of those big questions to take them holistically. So what I would like to see, for example, given the question, how operationally important is pyrethroid resistance? Let's agree what are the key set of experiments that need to be done.
Okay, but what I'm asking
put together the right set of people and get the donors and others within the...
What's the leverage point that would get us? So what needs to change out there for that to happen? That's what I'm trying to say, because it's all very well, can come up with, we all know in principle what some of the things that need to happen, but then they don't happen.
I guess in some ways, I hope it is happening. We have managed to get resistance onto the agenda. It's only a year ago now that we had the Global Plan for Insecticide Resistance Management come through. So rather than being something that we could sweep under the carpet, it's now out there on the open. It is a problem, it's an issue, here's the best we can do, but the problems have actually been stated in that report as well. We need really clear groups to take these forward. I think there is leadership that needs to come from WHO and others. People like myself need to join in and be part and parcel of that. But we need to act as a community rather than this fractured sort of set of groups all sort of operating in different silos.
Great, and I think one of the good things about having so many people in a room from different parts is to start that conversation. And just say I was just at Nike's headquarters in Portland, Oregon, where they were looking at the future of sustainable materials, very different from this, but similar complexity. And they had everyone from that system, 150 people from all around the world, representing the chemists, representing the regulators, representing the designers, representing the brand people, sitting in a room, working together as a system, in the same room, actually starting to understand the issue. So I can see the relevance of this meeting. Anyone else before we take a break? Yes, two. We'll just wait for the microphone.
Thank you. It's Hilary Hurd from Keele University. Could I come back to some of Joe's data on the usage of bed nets, where you showed a dip in the age of bed net usage in the young teenage years. I think that's potentially very worrying because, of course, if we're protecting children as infants, then when they are exposed, they're going to be much more severely affected by disease. What I'm wondering is whether that's the age of the childhood population when they are often in boarding school. And I haven't heard anybody mention targeting bed nets to schools for older children, and wonder whether that's something we should be thinking about.
Great, thank you. Joe.
It is done. There are parts of the world where if you haven't got a net, they won't let you into your boarding school. So encouraging that, yes, that would be a good thing. I would like to see a breakdown of that data. I saw some very nice data from Uganda, Mugasha, somebody like that. I suspect what this is that when you're very young, for the first few years, you sleep with your mum. And that's probably in a netted bed. But then when you get a younger sib, you get kicked out. And I suspect it's those older children who are often actually sleeping on a mat on the floor. Everybody else has got a bed, but the older children, they get the worst sleeping place. And I suspect there's not even a bed in many cases. So I bet you that not having a younger sib makes you much more likely to be still under the net. And if that's true, then it's a question of saying, okay, this is not enough nets in the house. I think when a lot of those data points were made, we were still on lots of households with just one net in the household. People crowd underneath it, but there's not room for everybody. They're the people who get excluded. When we hit 2 nets per household as more of a norm, I suspect that gap will be filled, and I think that's the way to fill it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, gentleman at the back, and then we're going to take a break. Yes, just here. So we're just going to give you a microphone.
Thank you. My name is Kola Ole Maxwell. I work for Malaria Consortium in Nigeria. I'm very happy to be here because I've noticed that at least 2 of the presenters mentioned Nigeria for various reasons. I actually have comments, not much of a question, and I will start from the last comment about encouraging people sleeping under net in the boarding school. This is actually one of the topics that we are encouraging the commercial sector partners in Nigeria to start exploring. And for me, the comment I have is following on the comment of Mikel about his observation about how WHO is treating the manufacturers. And I'm pleased to give him a feedback that that's exactly how the people down the line, the retail market, feel the manufacturers are treating them. The picture that Joe Lines actually showed, they are the people at the helm of affairs in terms of final mechanism of getting nets into the household, and they feel completely abandoned by the manufacturers as not being interested in what goes on. So my comment to Mikel is that it would be nice to start exploring innovations down the line for commercial sector partners to actually be doing their business, because the innovation is actually there. Yes, it's good to talk about innovation in terms of insecticide and so on, but all the mechanisms of getting people to use net and how they want to use net, I think that's the typical business way of doing things in terms of understanding the preferences of your users and what they actually will require. And I think we need more effort and need more encouragement for people to be doing this. At the moment, the manufacturers just face what the people they face, Global Fund, PMI, and so on, and less of the people that actually sleep under the net to be able to get these people to buy it. The second point...
Yeah, and just the second point, and then I'm going to cut you off, but you can make one more point.
Okay. The second point is, in working with the private sector as well, we need to actually be very clear, our objective. I'm glad that Karen mentioned use the private sector. If you want to use the private sector to sort of deliver a public health target, coverage, and so on, there's a clear way you work with them, rather than if you want to develop a market for a product. And that requires a different type of strategy. And we should be very clear how we engage private sector in doing this. Thank you.
Great. And that's clearly a really important point. And, you know, I see this all the time. You've got the sort of the commercial world, NGO world, and sort of institutional world. And they all want to maybe do the same thing ultimately, but actually they're not very good at communicating or understanding each other. And I think one of the things on the tables is to sort of is to build that knowledge and understanding, because actually there are different ways of doing it, and I'm sure there are ways, you know, collaboration is increasingly starting to happen, but it needs to happen on a much more deep and profound level, and as you say, in different places, not just in the production of the goods, it's actually in the supply chain and actually right the way down through the value chain. Great.